Good afternoon, Dr. McDowell. You're still sworn to tell the truth.
Yes, thank you. I acknowledge that.
Thank you. Madam.
Good afternoon, Dr. McDowell. I learned from the best. I apologize. I neglected to, good afternoon, Dr. McDowell, first of all.
Good afternoon again.
I neglected to cover off a few areas with you. I don't think I'll be too much longer, but you mentioned something before the lunch break about Stanley Sperling, who had refused to take a petition to Parliament. In what context was that? I wasn't sure about that incident.
I believe it was a petition of members of the community, some members of the community in Tuckerstown.
Tuckerstown? Okay.
I believe it's alluded to in Dr. Francis's paper.
Okay. And just so I'm clear, I'm going to bring up one petition, but I think we have a copy of one petition. Were you aware of one or more petitions?
I was aware of, I'm just losing, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I see what's happening. I focused and I was aware of and looked very closely at the petition of the 23 members of the community, which was coordinated by the minister. I believe this was another one, but again, Dr. Francis has covered that.
Okay. So we're going to bring up one, and you can tell me whether that's the one you looked at. So you think there were two petitions, one that Sperling wasn't prepared to take, and one that was signed by 23 members that was taken to Parliament?
This is the one I'm talking about, yes. I would urge you to look at Dr. Francis's paper to check that second one.
Okay, I will. I was just wanting to get from you what you were speaking of.
This one, indeed.
Okay, so you're speaking of this one, and we had discussed Roy Talbot, and you quite rightly said, although he was 5 years old at the time of the extradition, the acquisition of the land, that he was at least close, he was one generation removed from it. Correct?
Yes.
And if we go look at this petition,
you'll see his father's name somewhere.
Yes, yeah, I'm just going to come to that if you give me a moment. Yeah, the third name, or fourth name down, Osmond Charles Talbot was his father, correct?
That's right, and you'll see a plaque in Marsden Church now commemorating him.
Yes. So although Roy Talbot, at 5 years old, and then subsequently went on to have a life that he felt satisfied with, his father signed the petition against losing his land at the time.
Yes, he did.
Okay.
Exactly what his motivation was, we don't know. We can surmise that. I think earlier in the petition they talk about their way of life, etc., a sense of community.
Yes. And indeed, that was something that you found in speaking to people, was that the loss of this sense of community, this sharing, the type of community they had, was quite significant.
Yes, and I think that really is going to be the case in any expedition. You talk to the people in the St. Lawrence Seaway, no matter how they were treated, there was a sense of loss of community in it. I mean, it was gone. I suggested that parts of it were reconstructed or carried on to the new places, in that a fair number of them did seem to end up in Smith. But nonetheless, a way of life was gone, especially because usually we relate a way of life to its rootedness in the geography of what we're used to.
Yes. One thing I hadn't spoken to you about, and I should have mentioned when we were talking about the resurgence of tourism, sort of on a more grander global scale after the war. Another thing that was happening around this time, and you may have touched on it, but I didn't, was prohibition in the U.S. and coming here to have a good old party.
You're absolutely right. That was the unspoken secret of tourism in Bermuda.
Yes.
You could drink here. And that was not foregrounded in any of the literature, but believe me, it was transmitted by word of mouth or word of lip or whatever it was.
Yes.
And, you know, the micro control of the Board of Development, the Trade Development Board, was so close that when the Tower drugstore down there on, is it on Reed Street or Church Street, began producing postcards to send home, a kind of indirect kind of advertising of your product. They produced several of people drinking with kind of limericks underneath it. And the Tower was made to understand this was not to happen. These were not going to be sent around. They could trust that the word of mouth got people to come to Bermuda. They could start drinking the moment you got on the ship to come there. So, yep,
Yeah.
that was part of it. And of course, some of these merchants were in the liquor trade. You know, it
Gosling.
yeah.
Yeah.
By the way, you showed me a second ago the petition.
Yes.
I think it's worth noting that that petition did appear in the Assembly, whatever you call the adjacent book to the Assembly, indicating that these people had some agency. I mean, the petition is published and available to read, and that to some degree indicates that their powerlessness in the political system did get at times a toehold.
Well, they were able to present it to the political system, but
Yeah.
whether or not it had any teeth in that arena is another issue, you'd agree.
Oh, I agree.
You indicated both, I think, now and in your evidence on the previous occasion that, I'm just looking for it, that that the people 100 years ago in Bermuda, you didn't suspect that the people in Tuckerstown were much connected with the world. So they come to this in a very unequal way. I'm just now quoting your evidence, and for the commissioner's benefit, at page 6 of October 22nd. So they come to this in a very unequal way. Luckily, in the Tuckerstown situation, they had certain allies, a Methodist minister who probably was more connected with the way the world worked, who spoke for them. You're referring to Mr. Marsden.
No, not Marston.
Oh.
It was Joshua Marston, who came from away. Harvard, isn't it? I forget.
Okay, I wasn't sure.
Yes, in that he would have had theological training somewhere. He, of course, had seen the broader world and would be connected. Bermuda is an insular society and was very much then. The outside world came either by telegraph, or papers coming on the ship. It's not the instantaneous world we lived in. And I think not just of Tuckerstown residents at this time, but residents scattered through Bermuda would not have been in touch with much of the rest of the world.
Did you have access in any of your research to any of the papers that were published and meant for a black reading audience in Bermuda?
Yeah, I've looked at the, can't recall.
The Recorder?
But I've read the Recorder and use it. There were a number of other very briefly lived black publications, yes. But no, there wasn't a great deal of black voice in this. My wife was, by the way, working on, very interested in Marcus Garvey's connection to Bermuda, and that too is very hard to trace.
And the reason I asked you about the black newspapers, what struck me from reading them, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is the great deal of interest and knowledge about what was going on in the rest of the world in those particular publications.
In what time? What time are you talking about? What decade or?
Well, 20s, 30s, 40s.
Certainly in the 30s and 40s and 50s, it really begins to have an effect on Bermuda as the kind of global organization that Garvey and people were putting together. Clearly connected the black world. I don't know in 1920 how much that was the case, and I honestly didn't look very closely at that.
Okay. I want to take you specifically to an issue I'm sorry, just give me one moment. With respect to the Tuckerstown Cemetery or graveyard, I think you have done some reading about that issue?
Yes, I have. In the commentary last week, I cannot recall anything in the papers that do exist pertaining to Tuckerstown, any mention of the cemetery. The church was moved, that was understood. The cemetery, I don't know what arrangement was made for that. I hope I made clear that I think that is an inalienable right to maintain connection with those who have gone before you in the cemetery.
And you haven't seen any documentation, agreements, letters, anything that touches on the issue of who was to care for the cemetery, how it would be dealt with, nothing like that?
No, and neither was it my intent. I believe other people have done work on this, and there has been some partial recognition of the sanctity of the cemetery, but they could speak much more authoritatively than I could.
All right. And just in relation to that, you were aware that, maybe you weren't, but are you aware that you were quoted in the Bermuda Sun way back in 1998 regarding the restoration of the Tuckerstown graveyard?
I can't recall that. Can you
I don't blame you. I wouldn't recall that far back either. If we could have that exhibit, it is page 10 of Mr. Stovall's exhibit. I'm sorry, I don't remember whether it was an exhibit 1, I think it was, for him. Oh, okay. So, I don't know, are you able to see that, Dr. McDowell?
Yeah, I am, yes.
Okay, so this is Tuckerstown Graveyard Restored. This was the first time.
Yes.
And then there were subsequent events. But what's of note to me is just before you go to the small continuation of the article, it says, earlier this year, Canadian historian Duncan McDowell, who's writing a book about the history of tourism in Bermuda, shed new light on the whole Tuckerstown episode in a series of public lectures. And that's the lectures you told us about, correct?
Yes.
The residents, who were mainly farmers and fishermen, were forced to sell their land so that Tuckerstown could become the exclusive enclave it now is. The two churches were also moved out, and it refers to Marsden and St. Philip's AME. Dr. McDowell described the move as one in which the interests of a politically powerless people were overruled by a powerful commercial elite. But he also said it also brought prosperity to all of Bermuda because it laid the groundwork for the development of modern tourism.
Yes, that's essentially what I think I've been saying today, yes.
Yes. Coupled with those comments, you have also well, let me just stop here for a minute. Those comments, I think it is what you've been saying, that the politically powerless were overruled or overcome by the commercial elite, the powerful commercial elite. But we've talked a lot about whether it alone, Tuckerstown, laid the groundwork for the development of modern tourism. And I think you would agree with me now that may be a too simplistic of a view, to say Tuckerstown laid the groundwork for the development of modern tourism?
Yes, but remember, this is a newspaper article where the reporter, Meredith Evan in this case, who I know, is given 400 words or whatever it is and has to condense something into a manageable amount. So there is a natural kind of reductionism in that.
Yeah, fair enough, fair enough.
Yeah, I would acknowledge there are other factors.
Okay.
By the way, I noticed in the scroll, if you could scroll that up a wee bit,
Sure.
to the bigger article, I noticed the names now, it's jogging my memory, of some of the people I did talk to over on the side. Yeah, Queenie Simmons. These are the people who and Ross Talbot, who I did interview for them. The names I now remember, or it
Good.
jogs my memory. So I just point that out.
Thank you, appreciate that. As far as and you have said it's an inalienable right, you've actually written about at least one of our cemeteries in Bermuda, correct?
Yes, the one on Grenadier Lane over in St. George, yeah.
And you talk quite meaningfully about how it's a piece of history. There is,
It's powerfully evocative to walk
Yes.
through it. But in bringing that up, you're right. There's a very stark contrast between that and the other military cemeteries in Bermuda, which, of course, sit on a kind of British connection. Most of the people in there are British servicemen, some Allied people. And they have had a continuity and a sanctity right from day one when the first people were put in, say, in the yellow fever epidemics of the 19th century. That is a contrast, of course, to the fate of the cemetery in Tuckerstown. I mean, that's a good example of the asymmetric power relationships.
yes, we would be hearing a lot more, we would hear a lot about it if, in fact, some of those other cemeteries had been treated similarly, I would think.
I think you're right.
You have spoken a few times about the fact that, well, at least in relation to Tuckerstown and in relation to St. David's, there was some form of due process granted to the people.
Yes.
There are those that might quarrel with you, and I'm going to let you comment on this. They might quarrel with you and say, well, due process when the committee that wants to take your land puts a value on it and interviews you. If you disagree, the committee that arbitrates it are from the same group of people. And if you have the right to a jury, as one case they did and one case they didn't, the Tuckerstown had a jury system, the other didn't. The jury is appointed by the committee that disagreed with you, essentially. How do you see that as due process? I'm having difficulty with the sense that there is any kind of fairness, because due process requires some fairness or some neutrality.
I'm coming off the point made this morning that my feeling is this is not theft, because theft, as I think made clear, it involves no process. It involves simply taking with no responsibility, no reciprocity. This, Tuckerstown at least had a process. And Yes, the point was made last week, and I agree with it. It's very hard to quantify it, but they were dealing with an all-powerful group who, I suppose, one could have reached the conclusion that if I say no, I'm going to be off this land anyway. But there was due process, and the price paid to the first large majority of people who took it up was, although we can't really pin it down, did seem to be a fair price, did seem to be probably a bit above the market value price of that land. I think I perhaps suggested last week that it was in the interest of the developers to come in high because it would get the people off the land quite quickly. Whether they moved that quickly because they saw behind the curtain of this the power of the state, as represented by the assembly at the time, I don't know. It's hard to know that. Clearly, it is a possibility. And especially if the three stages laid before them had a compulsory one at the end of the line. Mm-hmm. And clearly, as you pointed out, because the people administering the process were part of the establishment. There's no denying about that.
The people administering...
There is a process here. That's the point I'm making. The ultimate fairness of it, it certainly wouldn't pass today because those being expropriated would have had allies in it. A lawyer such as yourself would obviously be taken on by the group to defend itself. But we have to, historians always have to set things in the context of the time.
But even at the time, certainly in Britain, in Bermuda, we were well familiar with the concepts of justice in a court of law, where there was a neutral person sitting arbitrating disputes. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't a new concept or an unknown concept that perhaps these bodies that were arbitrating whether or not the amount was fair or the process was fair should have been neutral.
It wasn't, and I think it was hard to think that it could have been at the time. It wouldn't have entered the mind of the elite, and it simply wasn't in the playbook of how expropriations were handled. And remember, expropriation had a long history in Bermuda. It had been used for the military, by the road system. It would be used for the railway. This wasn't any unique application of it.
No, it had been used quite effectively, repeatedly up to this point, to mostly expropriate lands of black Bermudians.
Yeah, but not exclusively.
No, but mostly.
Yes, because the demographics, yes.
I wanted to get back just before I finish, and I will finish up. I apologize for being so long. I appreciate your help. I wanted to get back to the St. David's appropriation of lands. And we were talking a bit about the war, and I don't want to go down the whole war strategy path because that goes beyond where we need to go. But just dates-wise, you were saying, well, it was important, and I appreciate what you were saying. It was important because by, for instance, 1940, there was a situation with a U-boat that might have been maybe trying to intercept some supplies.
No, there was the famous incident when a ship called the Birmingham, the SS Birmingham, was torpedoed en route to Bermuda, and the colony really went into kind of a austerity situation. You would read the Royal Gazette for those years, and you see this rationing. People are encouraged to, have victory gardens, all that sort of stuff. So there was this precariousness that threatened Bermuda directly, rather than just a threat to the Allies more broadly.
And that was true in most allied nation states. There was a rationing and a call to the citizens to aid in the efforts, right?
True enough, but Bermuda's a small place, and if the ship didn't come, you would start running out of things pretty quickly.
Especially because the farmlands on St. David's and the farmlands on Tucker's Town have been taken away, right? That limited the ability for the colony to sustain itself.
Yes, but don't forget you need fuel oil, you need all sorts of other things that you can't grow or get in Bermuda.
Yeah, no, but the first and foremost, you need food, right?
Yes, oh yeah,
Yeah.
and Bermuda could feed itself during the war, but it required quite an adjustment.
You said that this was, this post on St. David's was going to assist with respect to the supply ships. How many, between the between late November 1940, early 1941, when people were in fact forced out of their homes on St. David's, and let's say when the construction was completed about 1943, I have been unable to uncover, and maybe you can help me, I've been unable to uncover any significant military operations by the U.S. from the St. David's base that would have assisted in any way the British war effort.
Well, until the runways were open, there was nothing they could do. You know, aircraft had to land and return to base, etc. Until that's done, the runways are in place, nothing can happen. I don't know about the naval annex, whether those docks were used. Certainly, I know the Canadian Navy, I'm not a military historian,
Yeah,
the
I'm
Canadian
sorry.
Navy worked out of Bermuda very early on in the war. It was a way they, as they call it, worked up a ship to make sure it worked, and also was near the convoy routes. The Americans, I don't know.
Yeah, the
Until
Canadian
air-
Navy, though, wasn't working out of St. David's.
No, the air base was no good until it could take aircraft, and I forget the date when the first aircraft landed.
Yeah. But as far as any significant military assistance, which is what the St. David Islanders were called upon to give up their homes for, to give up their homes so that the U.S. could have a base there, and somehow it was, they had to be loyal to Britain and let the U.S. have that base there. There was really no significant military assistance until after the U.S. joined the war, first of all, correct?
Well, no, some of it, the Lend-Lease agreement was signed before that.
Yes.
And I think you have to see this in terms of building. The term is often used of an Atlantic bridge between America and Canada and Britain in particular, that facilitated logistically the movement of war material and food, etc., across the Atlantic. So you can't expect, you know, a battle of Midway to be fought just off the shore of Bermuda. It was more an ongoing logistical support of having air cover once the airport was open, and in the interim having ships that were to protect the convoys and go after submarines come into port in Bermuda. So I think it was a significant support. And two other things. One, it enhanced that old relationship between America and Britain, which had been there most of World War I, etc., which, if you think of the present-day situation, it's believed is in very bad repair, as Mr. Trump has pulled America away from Europe. The second thing to remark is that, of course, America lived by the Monroe Doctrine of 1822. They saw the hemisphere as their bailiwick, and Bermuda was in that. And in having bases in Bermuda, the Monroe, you mentioned earlier, protected the American coast to make sure that it was secure. And surely that was one of the messages of Pearl Harbor, that we could be attacked, you know, and we should ensure we keep Hawaii and Bermuda, although it's not American territory, we should de facto have a presence there.
Okay. But, so what I'm taking from that, and I know you're not a military historian, but I'm trying to understand the benefit to Bermuda, to Britain, of having this base during wartime, having these people moved out of their homes. And you're saying primarily it was used as a spot where, what, the U.S. was bringing supplies for Britain, war supplies?
Well, and Canada.
Okay, but Canada was bringing war supplies to the U.S. base in St. David's?
No.
Oh, okay.
The base wasn't about bringing supplies to Bermuda. It was providing a platform, a kind of mid-Atlantic aircraft carrier, if you like, from which American and Canadian and British aircraft could either operate or be ferried. We have to remember aircraft at that time didn't have the long legs that they have now, and they needed gas and all that sort of stuff. So Bermuda was ideally situated, as were the Azores before the war, etc., or going down to Brazil to Belém and going across. It was a strategic advantage to the Allies to have this base in the middle of the Atlantic. And conversely, the fear was that if the Germans got it, it would put America in a kind of Pearl Harbor jeopardy. I've never seen any intimation that the Germans had an active plan for attacking Bermuda. It would have been very hard with the reefs and everything.
Yeah, I think if you read through the military history, there's no suggestion that Bermuda was ever in any serious danger from Germany. Is that fair?
Well, except that the U-boats were cutting off supply, and that if the serious danger existed if England collapsed, Bermuda, as a British colony, would be in jeopardy.
And probably be American.
Yes, exactly.
Just saying.
The Monroe Doctrine again.
Yes. All right. I think that is it. If I can just have a moment to speak with Mr. Yes, I think those are all my questions. I think some of the commissioners may have some follow-up questions, and I thank you very much for your time and your sharing your expertise with us, Mr. McDowell.
Thank you for your questions.
Thank you, Council. Yes, Dr. McDowell, commissioners will be asking a few questions. We'll start with Mrs. Fort. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Dr. McDowell.
Yep. All right.
I've learned from your report today, your article today, that the primarily black community of Tuckerstown built 2 churches, a school, a post office. They had a cemetery, a cricket pitch. They produced, based on what you said, a family of well-known musicians. And I learned in a previous report that one family had many horses, more than a dozen horses, and that family also had a very well-built home. It still remains today, occupied by a white Bermudian today, Dr. Campbell, I think that's the name that was mentioned, which also they left behind a grand piano. And what I'm trying to understand, why was it, in your opinion, why was it necessary for the Bermuda Committee to paint these people as being unsophisticated? And what were they measuring as unsophisticated when they were sophisticated enough to build homes that still remain 100 years later, and schools and post office? Why do you feel it was necessary to go that great length to make the community, the world, and the British Empire feel that these people were unsophisticated, that some own 70 acres, some own 35 acres or more? I'm trying to understand that.
Thank you. 2 answers to that. One, the developers themselves, at least in my reading of the assembly debates and what's in the paper, didn't use that language very much. But as Dr. Francis points out, there was a very pervasive attitude in, let's say, white North America that denigrated black culture and civilization. And that, I think, was felt by the white elite, that this was seen as an unprogressive group. They didn't much indulge in that. They may have over their dinner tables or their luncheons, but I think, as has been made clear, they knew they had the political power ultimately to do this. The kind of language that is upsetting, which you remarked on, comes after the fact. I quoted it in the paper you just talked about. Came in the 20s and 30s, periodically as white local historians or journalists in passing talked about Tuckerstown, and it seemed a convenient way to kind of make a justification for it, that they were degenerate, that they weren't going anywhere. And that clearly ran against the facts that you've just demonstrated of people living a sustainable way of life there. Some much better than others. I mean, like any community, some people succeed better than others or have different goals in life. Brian Talbot, who seemed to be the most entrepreneurial member of the community, owned the most land and had diversified himself, clearly was an example that didn't in any way justify that racial stereotype. But again, Dr. Francis, I think, does a very good job of showing how blacks were portrayed in America in particular, and how some of that attitude washed over into the treatment of Tuckerstown.
Okay, and the second question is surrounding the St. David's, the community there that was displaced. And the reasons given for their displacement was based on previous reports, and yours to some extent, that the reasons given was it would be a great benefit for them, to assist with this World War II, that they will be benefiting the World War II. And also, it will show loyalty to the British Empire. But yet, maybe you can help me understand this. They were given only 10 days to vacate their premises. They were seniors, vulnerable people. For them giving up so much to such a great benefit that they were providing, but yet, can you tell me why they rushed them out of their community, their homes, which I've said before, a man's home is his castle, and then placed them in barracks? Why would they, in my opinion, it feels like they, a lack of empathy, and also they dehumanized that community. Why was it necessary to do so? And I'm learning now that it was not necessary for 2 years after they vacated.
Well, they had to be vacated before the bulldozers could arrive. I mean, the construction had to begin. But to go back, you're quite right. Any expropriation is dehumanizing. Really, no matter how well it is done, it could be done harshly and more dehumanizing. But again, to go back to the point, in 1940, the war was at a very grim ebb. There was this pressure militarily to get on with it. We felt this in Canada as land was appropriated for air bases, etc., and people were moved. I don't want to say it's comparable to Bermuda. I don't know enough about how the people were treated. But I don't know what more to say, except that there was this pressure that people had to be moved very quickly. And clearly, I think it's from the other report, the temporary accommodation tended to fall down. It didn't meet expectations as people were pushed out of the way, etc. So that's really what I could say to that.
So do you think that both processes were fairly handled then?
Well, it's very hard to apply in terms of fair and just to an expropriation, which by its very nature is asymmetrical or unbalanced, the power between the state or its proxy, the military in this case, and the community at hand. It is unfair in the sense that people are losing a way of life, a rootedness. The only benefit you could point to them is that in doing this, you are in the long term enhancing the quality of life we have. We don't want the Nazis to win. It is unfair depending on what focus you put on it. I'm afraid in history we just never can arrive at one categorical judgment. We can for something like slavery, which is clearly, beyond any moral pale. But in the confusion of war, there isn't one perfect answer. It is much to the credit of the people of St. David's, some black, some white, even some of native heritage, that they, by and large, respected this notion of going to Britain's assistance. There were people in Canada in World War I and World War II, mainly our Quebecois, our French-Canadian colleagues, who saw less reason to go to the defense of Europe. They had been cut off from Europe since the conquest, etc. They felt a bit like the American isolationists. But in the end, they came around, and we didn't need conscription until the very end of World War II. And many French Canadians fought for the cause, even though their threshold of emotion was less than that of a British-oriented Canadian.
Thank you very much.
So, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fort and Dr. McDowell. Mr. Stovall, time for you to ask questions.
Yes. Good afternoon, Dr. McDowell. I
Again.
have a few questions. I'll try to be as concise as I possibly can. You spoke to the sanctity of land ownership. So in your opinion, when does that sanctity begin? Before or after expropriation? And by extension, does that sanctity not deem it worth restoration or reparation?
Sanctity, you'd be well served by having a property lawyer appear before you, because they could tell you at what point ownership becomes embedded in it. I would think a lawyer defending somebody who owned the property now and was resisting any kind of repatriation of it would argue that that person is protected by our legal system, that once you take deed of something, it belongs to you. If you could prove egregious behavior in the expropriation, perhaps you could come back on them. But I think it would be very hard, particularly at this distance of 1 century out after that property has passed through a number of hands, each one of which has been invested by the sanctity of property. I don't know if it was mentioned, but I headed Canada's so-called Nazi Gold Commission in the 1990s, which investigated that horrendous treatment of Jews in the Holocaust and the German and Swiss participation in taking their gold, at sometimes quite literally off their fingers and out of their mouths and out of their bank accounts, and applying it to the war machine. That also applied to art. The Germans swiped, and here was real theft, art that was owned by Jews and other Europeans. Goring loved collecting art. There have been many cases since then about trying to repatriate that art to its rightful owners. It varies from country to country. Each country has a different property law. Some countries respect that if you, in all good knowledge, bought a painting, not knowing its provenance, it is yours. Other countries force you to surrender it back to the original owner. So it's a mixed sort of situation there. But property, the old say about the law is 9/10 about property. Again, if you've got a property lawyer, and I think he or she could give you a much better answer to your question. But sanctity of property is pretty much at the center of our way of life. And it is very hard to divest someone of their property without due process. We've been arguing whether the due process in Tuckerstown was fair, and there were elements of it that weren't fair. But at least it was a process. At least it was rooted in some kind of legitimized procedure.
You might say a slave auction was legitimate too, but I
Yes.
digress. Next question. Have you ever come across any evidence that the community of Tuckerstown was struggling, looking for some sort of economic handout, social welfare pleadings they were making, concerns that they would be wards of the state? In other words, is there any justification for the common narrative that have those settlers and citizens have endured over the decades?
To apply terms like handout and social welfare assistance, these are questions at the other end of the 20th century that all communities now generally naturally come to ask for. They weren't in the vocabulary at the beginning of the century. These were, Bermudians are rugged individualists, a great generalization, comes from living on an island, etc. The people, I've never seen anything from the Tuckerstown people requesting that, because it simply wasn't, in the mentality of the time. The most they would have looked for, probably through their church, was a kind of community assistance, but they weren't going down to the assembly saying, we need a subsidy or whatever. That simply wasn't in the cards at the time. They were a viable community at a subsistence level, and they were getting by. There's no denying that, and they built a sense of community around it. But my sense is that it was pretty much at the low end of the social economic ladder in Bermuda. And that's where they were. And the question has been asked, could they have sustained that? What if tourism had never come to Bermuda or Tuckerstown had never been developed? Well, I think they probably would have continued along that line, although my hunch is that they would have become increasingly on the margins because of the decline of agriculture, et cetera, and fishing and boat building, et cetera. But that's speculation. They were hardy people. They were not going to ask Hamilton for assistance. I don't think anyone at the time was, except for things like building lighthouses and that's the sort of thing government did at the time. But they weren't into any kind of social welfare in that sense.
To that point, if I just might, and you may not be aware of it, we've had testimony by Mr. Richardson, who was the descendant of Mr. J.D. Talbot, that he was a very prominent Oddfellows, friendly society member. So within the context of Bermuda society, those organizations were at the upper end of black society and networking in Bermuda. So when I hear you say about socially they were getting by, it doesn't jibe with what's now emerging as the character of the people that actually live there. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention, which falls within what we have experienced as the narrative. So we're now finding other aspects to that.
Good point, and I think as I perhaps suggested a little while ago, we shouldn't fall into the trap of talking about a community as if it's a homogenous group. I mean, it's homogenous in some sense. It's all black, as we know. But some people succeed more. Brian Talbot clearly was someone who had diversified, was linked to other aspects of the community. He had built up movable wealth, which probably was not the case for many people. So, yes, if they had connection to some island-wide communities, the friendly societies, etc., and of course the Methodist Church would have been another linkage to the rest of the community. We don't want to talk about the community in totally generalized terms, but I think, again, in a kind of aggregated fashion, this again, I think, was a community that was at the low end of the social economic scale. And I don't mean that to demean them. That was just the situation they found themselves in, with some exceptions, as you just pointed out.
I just have one other question, and it's sort of along the lines of what you're discussing, or what you've just said. Overall, Bermuda society, you mentioned that overall Bermuda society was declining, and you just mentioned that, in your opinion, the Takistan community was at the lower end of the social society, if you will. But within the context of the time and the players, would it be fair to say that when speaking out about the welfare of Bermuda, it was probably in reference to white Bermudians? And let me further characterize it as the welfare of black Bermudian society at large was not a major concern of theirs.
You're right in the sense that the whole of the Tuckerstown development was framed by a kind of white expectation of what tourism might do for the colony. But beyond that, and again, we don't know what they talked about over the dinner table, etc., raised the concept of trickle down. I think there was some awareness that in promoting this industry and making it work well, at a time when Bermuda's ultimate vision was really in jeopardy, or what would the 20s bring to Bermuda, there was a sense that if we get this right, it will sure work very well for us and our liquor and our links with the hotel and the steamship company. But it will trickle down, and that will create employment, either in building the homes in Tuckerstown or the hotels or working. We talked about this earlier. So I don't think they were oblivious to that. And the reality is, of course, they needed the rest of the community to make this work. They needed people to work in the hotels, to drive the taxi, the horse cabs and all that sort of stuff. So yes, their primary dedication was to enhancing the connection of the white mercantile group to a growing world industry, tourism. And again, they did this brilliantly, I must say. But it was a very exclusive racial view, but I don't think they were oblivious to that. They needed the rest of the population to make it all work.
To work, yes, they needed the labor.
Yes, and you know, let's say as a loose comparison, we know that after World War I, many blacks in the southern United States realized that agriculture was failing. You know, the old plantation system and cotton, all that was failing, and their life as sharecroppers was simply going nowhere. They were being exploited by the people who rented them the land. So millions of them headed north into the industrial heartland of America, Chicago, Pittsburgh, you name it. And if we compare that to the course of Bermudians in these same decades, the Bermudian black community, to generalize, did much, much better. You know, we look at America today and see the gaping inequality between many minorities, Hispanic, black, etc., and the reality of white Americans. I mean, it's appalling. The course taken by Bermuda through tourism, admittedly controlled by the white elite and their offshore allies, did produce a better quality of life and prosperity for black Bermuda. I saw in the clipping I was shown a few minutes ago, Craig Tucker's name. Craig I got to know in Bermuda, and his brother. And their father, as you probably know, was Rodney, was one of the Tuckers, the Talbot brothers, not born in Tuckerstown. But Rodney got a job. His job out of all this was to become a barber on the American base over at St. David's, which was a job he had for life. And in as close as I ever came to him, he seemed to find dignity and prosperity in that. And certainly his two sons have gone on to very commendable careers in the professions in Bermuda. I'm not saying that's the absolute example, but it is an example of the kind of springboard Bermuda found itself on with tourism that many Black Americans have never got near. So that's a big generalization, that parallel.
If I may, and this would be more a comment, the irony of what you've said is perhaps in spite of, not because of, and from the perspective of Tuckerstown may have been emerging, may have been on the uprise, which is the counterpoint to the perspective of the declining by the mercantile elite. And that'll be my last point.
Thank you.
Do you wish? The next person will be Mr. Starling. The next question will come from Mr. Starling. Did you wish to comment on that, Dr. McDowell? No?
No, I'll take it.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Dr. McDowell. So I have some academic training in geography, and I was struck by the comparison of spatial silence that you speak to in your 96 article concerning the Wilfred King's handy map, where Tuckerstown is almost empty in a way. And it made me think about what you were mentioning earlier about historical silence, and I just wanted to start this by saying I appreciate the ability to explore the evidence and expand on it. So there's some value, intrinsic value in that. Drawing on my my limited training in geography, I noted on page 21 of your Trading Places document that you refer to the Tuckerstown expropriation as a form of gentrification. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes, I think so. Yes.
Thank you. I've heard some people in Bermuda describe Tuckerstown, what happened, as a form of ethnic cleansing, not in the Balkan sense of deaths and liquidation of people, but more in the sense of the destruction of a black space and the production of an exclusive white space. And I noted in particular on page 28 of your Trading Places, there was a talk about how one of the Bermuda Development Corporation people was hired almost to ensure that young black boys were kept off the property. And so I was just thinking about the production of space. Would you agree that one could argue this was a form of ethnic cleansing without the deaths?
I would agree. That is an extremely loaded phrase, because we now associate it with the terrible things that happened in Serbia, etc.
Yeah.
It's a bit, we've seen a lot of use of the word genocide in Canada with our native peoples, etc. So I'm very reluctant to use that term because it connotes something that I don't think was there, as you indicated. Mm-hmm. But you're quite right in the sense that the success of Tuckerstown was predicated on a kind of racial exclusivity. Mm-hmm. They wanted to appeal to people who wanted to live amongst their own, not just in racial terms, but in class terms. They wanted to have Michael Bloomberg as a neighbor, if you see what I mean. And most of the black and white people in Bermuda did not fit that definition, class or racial. So this was like, as we mentioned before, like a gated community where you had a kind of homogenized, empathetic kind of community living together, and everything is catered along those lines. It excludes things. And then the removal of the road from the handy map was to make sure it was sort of out of sight, out of mind for those purposes. They didn't want tourists rubbernecking up there. So I agree with you. The term you have to be extremely careful with. Our truth and, one of the commissions we've had was on the Native women who have gone missing in the urban environment, often got pulled into prostitution and terrible violence, and they have disappeared. And that Royal Commission concluded that this was a form of cultural genocide. Well, in using that term, they deflected the very useful recommendations of that commission into a debate about what is genocide. And that deflected the kind of utility of the commission into useful police reform. So I'm reluctant to use words like that because they come so loaded with other definitions. But I agree with your general purpose point that this was to be a whites-only area of wealthy whites.
Yeah, I agree it's a loaded term. I know it's bandied about, so I wanted to give you that opportunity to respond to people who might describe it as such.
Yeah.
And just for my own edification, this is just drawing on some conversation you've had with council and some of my other commissioners. I just want to distill into my own understanding. If we were to look at Bermuda in 1920 and even in 1940, would we recognize it as a democracy?
No, we would recognize it as what's sometimes called a kind of plantation democracy, very common throughout the colonial world, where the economic rationale of the place was that it supplied the metropole with whatever. And this is actually not quite the case in Bermuda, but with sugar and tobacco, and you needed an elite that could ensure that connection worked well and brought benefit to the colony through their agency. So, it's ironic in Bermuda. You have one of the longest-lived assemblies in the English-speaking world, longer than Canada. But until 1968, it was remarkably controlled, and women got the vote in 44, and I'm somewhere in the mid-20th century, women got the vote. So it has not been the kind of democracy we would like to teach in Politics 100 since 1968. Right. And I must say, as an outsider, I think Bermuda politics in that last 50 years, 50 years or so, has matured remarkably into a very viable, workable democracy. I mean, that's just my feeling. And I've seen so many other places deteriorate away from that possibility. Look at the mess in Nigeria right now, for instance, but we're getting off topic.
Sure.
So it's not a perfect democracy, obviously not.
Thank you. I also have some limited academic training in economics, and I know that you're a historian of economics. Are you familiar with, I think Marx called it primitive accumulation, and other economists have called it accumulation by dispossession. And I was just wondering, are you familiar with that?
Not intimately, but yes, I know what you're talking about. And that applies here, I think.
Okay, well, that was my question. I'm just thinking about commodity exchanges and exchange values and use values, and I was just curious about that aspect.
The exchange in Bermuda, of course, has been largely in service commodity, if you know what I mean. There's no cotton or bauxite or anything like that, and the attempts to provide it never worked out. So it's a parallel. It's a different kind of application of that theory in Bermuda.
Well, Dr. McDowell, I appreciate you, so having this opportunity to explore the evidence with you. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think your microphone is off.
Sorry. Is there any redress? No redress.
No, thank you.
It leaves now for me to thank Dr. McDowell for coming again upon our recall and to deal with these issues for us. It has certainly enabled us to move ahead with our mandate. And I can't say that we won't call you again because we have served adverse notices. And if anyone comes in and say, well, I'd like to ask Dr. McDowell a few questions, I'm obliged to reach out to you again. But thank you very much, and all the very best. Have a great weekend.
That would
Thank
be
you.
my pleasure. Alberta knows how to get in touch with me. I'm in town. I thank you for the honor of appearing before you, and I wish you wisdom in your deliberation.
Thank you. Thank you.